Things like this keep us flexible and adaptable, which is another soft skill. And dealing with challenges is such a soft skill. But if you can use little analogies like this to help you, be like the buffalo and run into the storm. You're listening to Prospecting on Purpose, where we discuss all things prospecting, sales, business, and mindset. I'm your host, Sara Murray, a sales champion who's here to show you that you can be a shark in business and still lead with intentionality and authenticity. Tune in each week as we dive into methods to connect with clients, communicate with confidence, and close the deal. Welcome to Prospecting on Purpose. Following up on last week's episode on affirmations, today we have another short but powerful episode. I'm sharing a second tool that helps me stay positive and continuously take action and moving forward. This week, I'm going to share a few different analogies that illustrate best practices in how we show up in our business. And to be honest, I'm not sure if we would consider these metaphors, similes, or analogies. I've tried Googling and asking a few of my writer friends, and I still don't have full clarity. But since this isn't a podcast about grammar or the written word, I'm not stressing out about it too much, and we're just going to go with analogies. The ability to stay positive is something that has served me very well in my sales career and now my business. People want to work with people who are energizing, not draining. And if you're negative or self-serving, you're a drain, right? Positive people energize others. And that has always gravitated me to other positive people and vice versa. And recently I was a guest on a nationally syndicated radio show, The Price of Business. And the host, Kevin Price, told me that the reason he wanted me to be a guest on his show was that he was inspired by my optimism, positivity, and my half-full approach to sales and business. I will link the interview in the show notes, and at the end of this episode, I'm going to share an example of the steps that led to that interview and how it aligns to one of these analogies that I'm going to share. And then there's a really short behind-the-scenes kind of funny story. So stay tuned to the end, but this is a quick 2 examples here. I know that these analogies are going to make an impact on you the same way that they have on me. I think about them almost daily. So the first story here, you may have heard of it. And herd is a pun because we're going to be comparing a herd of buffalo to a herd of cows. Now, we have these 2 groups of animals just grazing out on the prairie. In this story, we're going to be in Colorado in the United States, and a storm rolls in. A storm rolls into the prairie. And the herd of cows, they see the storm coming and they turn and they run away from the storm. Now, cows are not fast, right? So the weather catches up to them pretty quickly. But by the time the storm finally reaches them, the cows are tired and they still have to keep running essentially along with the storm that's on top of them. It's prolonging the entire process of how much time and energy these cows are having to deal with this storm. Now, if we look over at the herd of buffalo or bison out there on the plain and the storm rolls in, the herd of buffalo are going to charge towards the storm. They're going to use all of that initial energy to quickly charge through the storm and out through the other side, minimizing the time and the bad weather and tackling that problem head on. Which group would we rather be? We want to be like the buffalo and run into the storm. Another similar analogy here in the same thread that I like to use is to kill the monster when it's small. So when you think of Godzilla, the giant reptilian monster terrorizing cities, he's extremely difficult to defeat. They make whole movies about trying to kill Godzilla. Well, what if we killed Godzilla when he was a little tiny baby lizard, right? Kill this monster when it's small means tackling a problem or an issue while it's still a little baby lizard instead of letting him grow to be a giant monster that's now significantly more difficult to deal with the problem. When it comes to doing something you don't want to deal with, like having a difficult conversation with your boss or dealing with an upset customer, remember to be like the buffalo and run into the storm and kill the monster when it's small. Okay, last analogy is a lighter one, but it's one of my favorites. It speaks to taking action and being brave in the face of the unknown. And as I mentioned last week, one of my favorite affirmations is action brings clarity. I can look back at the different steps that I've taken in my life and my career and point back to the pivot points that have gotten me to where I am right now. And that's what I mean when I say action brings clarity. One of the ways that I like to look at taking action is to imagine you're holding a flashlight. So you have a tool that illuminates the darkness in front of you. The darkness is the unknown, but really it's only illuminating the area directly in front of you. The only way that path will appear is to continue to take steps forward. You keep taking steps forward and the path illuminates. So I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that I was a guest on The Price of Business. I want to run through quickly the actions I took to book that interview because it illustrates the flashlight example of taking forward steps. My now friend, Joe Rando, is the founder of a company called Lifestar, and he sent me a LinkedIn message months ago inviting me to join a free Zoom event called the Solopreneur Success Sessions. And just a little sidebar note here, I, like all of you, probably receive a ton of LinkedIn messages. And most of the time, it's people trying to sell us something, and we usually never respond to those, right? Joe wasn't trying to sell me anything in his message. He was offering me value, which is what elicited a response from me. So we talk about this a lot, ABAV, always be adding value. This is a great example of how Joe used that tool to bring me into his orbit. So I attended the session and the topics were so great, very helpful for me. I learned about LinkedIn ads, which I hadn't learned before. I learned about how to revamp my homepage. So super helpful 90-minute session. And I was looking at Lifestar's website and I realized they have a podcast and they had an application to apply to be on the podcast. So I messaged them. I said, hey, I talk about sales. I talk about prospecting. I would love to be a guest on the show. We ended up recording the interview. It was an amazing interview. I'm really proud of it. I will link it in the show notes too. But now I know Joe and his marketing director, Carly, a lot more closely because we collaborated on a podcast episode together, right? So for an upcoming Solopreneur Success Sessions, they invited me to be a presenter on the show because I know their business better. They know my business better. And so I was presenting Prospecting on Purpose to this group. And before I was done with that presentation, I had an email from the producer of The Price of Business saying, we'd love for you to be a guest on the show. Very cool. And when you look back at the different steps, you can see it's just a matter of taking little steps that leads, you just never know where it's going to lead to. And when I booked the interview, this is my funny little story to wrap this up. I'm in the middle of a move at the time, and the room that I normally record things in, including the podcast, normally it has furniture, rugs, canvas paintings on the wall. I put pillows and blankets, to soundproof it a little bit better. But I just sort of forgot about that because it was a phone interview. And I call in and Kevin, the host, says, right before we are about to go live on the air, he says, it sounds like I'm calling in from a cavern or a cave. And there was a comforter on top of a box in this room. So I ended up throwing that blanket over my head and computer. And I asked him if it was any better. And then all of a sudden we're live on the air and I recorded the whole interview from under a comforter. So if you listen to the interview, the segment is about 11 minutes long, but the podcast listeners here will know the behind the scenes story that I was actually recording from essentially a blanket fort. And the audio is not as great as I would have liked it to be, but you know what? That's okay because things like this keep us flexible and adaptable, which is another soft skill. And dealing with challenges is such a soft skill. But if you can use little analogies like this to help you, be like the buffalo and run into the storm. I tell myself that every day. And I know it's silly, but it really, really works. So I hope that this helps you. I think a big part of this process is to remind ourselves to look back and always see how far we've come. This is episode 42 of this podcast. This has been a full year of producing the show every week. And I'm proud of how far I've come along the journey. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you listening to it and being a part of it with me. The listeners of this show bring me so much joy, and it'll be fun to see where these continued forward steps, holding this little flashlight is going to take prospecting on purpose. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much for listening to the Prospecting on Purpose podcast. If you loved what you heard today, subscribe to the podcast and please rate and leave a review. For more info on me, or if you'd like to work together, feel free to go to my website, saramurray.com. On social media, I'm usually hanging out at Sara Murray Sales. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.